I found the address hidden inside an old birthday card from someone named Sarah in my husband's desk drawer. That's when I knew 35 years of marriage was about to implode. I called my lawyer before I called David. And when I finally drove to that farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, I brought my phone fully charged and my backbone finally intact. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Let me backtrack so you understand how a reasonably intelligent 63-year-old woman ends up playing detective in her own marriage. For 8 years, David had been sending money to his sister Sarah in the countryside, $500 every single month like clockwork. When I'd asked about her early on, he'd gotten that patient tone men use when they think you're being silly. He's had a hard life, Maggie. Lost her husband young, raising her daughter alone. Family helps family. I'd felt guilty for even questioning it. David came from a big family scattered across 3 states. I'd only met a handful of them at our wedding decades ago. It seemed reasonable that he'd want to help a struggling sister. The business trip started about 6 years ago. Once a month, sometimes twice, David would drive out to check on Sarah for hours each way, always on a Saturday. She needs help with the property, he'd explain. Repairs, that sort of thing. When I suggested joining him, meeting this sister I'd been helping support, David always had a reason why it wasn't a good time. Sarah was shy. The house was too small for guests. She was going through a difficult period and wasn't up for meeting new people. After a while I stopped asking. How considerate of me, right? Making things easy for my husband's double life. Looking back now, I can see all the signs I deliberately ignored. The way he'd shower immediately after returning from his trips, how he kept his phone face down on the table, the smell of unfamiliar laundry detergent on his clothes occasionally. David had always handled our finances. I'm the lawyer, he'd say whenever I asked about our accounts. Let me deal with the boring stuff. I had access to one checking account for groceries and household expenses, but the investment accounts, retirement funds, his business accounts, those were too complicated for me to worry about. I'd trusted him completely. What a fool I'd been. But it was the birthday card that changed everything. I'd been looking for our property tax documents when I found it shoved in the back of his desk drawer. The envelope was addressed to David in looping feminine handwriting. Inside, the card showed a sunset over a lake. The message read, "Happy birthday to someone special. Thank you for everything you do for us. With love, Sarah and Emma." Emma. He'd never mentioned Sarah having a daughter named Emma. I photographed the return address with shaking hands, then carefully returned everything exactly as I'd found it. That night, over dinner, I asked casually, "How's your sister Sarah doing?" David didn't even look up from his pot roast. "Fine, same as always." "And her daughter? What was her name again?" The brief pause was almost imperceptible. "Lisa, her name's Lisa." He'd forgotten his own lie. I spent the next 3 days being the perfect wife while my mind raced through possibilities. Maybe Sarah had 2 daughters. Maybe I'd misread the card. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation. But I'd been married long enough to know the weight of a lie. It sits differently in the air between 2 people. On Thursday morning, after David left for work, I got in my car and started driving west toward that address in rural Pennsylvania. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd arrived to find exactly what David had described. A struggling sister, grateful for family support. The 4-hour drive gave me plenty of time to rehearse what I'd say. I'd be friendly, introduce myself as David's wife, laugh about never having met after all these years. We'd have coffee. I'd meet Emma or Lisa or whoever the daughter was. Everything would make sense. The countryside grew more remote as I drove, farms giving way to long stretches of forest. My GPS eventually directed me down a dirt road, then onto an even narrower lane. The house appeared suddenly around a bend. A small but well-maintained farmhouse with blue shutters and flower boxes under the windows. This wasn't the struggling property David had described. The lawn was manicured. Fresh paint gleamed on the porch. Apparently, poverty looks different when you're spending someone else's money. And in the driveway sat David's car. It was only 11 in the morning on a Tuesday. David was supposed to be at his office in Philadelphia reviewing contracts. Yet there was his silver Lexus parked at an angle in the gravel driveway, as if he'd been in a hurry to get inside. I pulled my car off the narrow lane about 50 yards back, partially hidden behind an overgrown hedge. My hands trembled as I cut the engine. For several long minutes, I just sat there staring at that cheerful blue house with its welcoming flower boxes, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with 8 years of supposed charity. The property sprawled across several acres. Behind the house, I could see a newer barn structure and what looked like a chicken coop. A wooden swing set stood in the side yard, the kind you'd spend $1,500 on from a specialty store. Not exactly the image of desperate poverty David had painted. I'd brought binoculars, another thing I never imagined doing at 63, sitting in my car like some private investigator from a bad movie. Through the lenses, I could see more details. Solar panels on the roof, a greenhouse attached to the barn, a late-model SUV parked beside David's Lexus. The front door opened. I held my breath. A woman emerged, young enough to be my daughter, maybe 35 at most, with long auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wore jeans and a fitted sweater that showed off a figure that definitely wasn't 63. She walked to the SUV, retrieved something from the back, then turned and smiled at someone inside the house. David appeared in the doorway. He pulled her close and kissed her. Not a brotherly peck on the cheek, a real kiss, the kind that told a story of familiarity and intimacy. My chest constricted so tightly I thought I might be having a heart attack. The binoculars slipped from my shaking hands, clattering against the steering wheel. This was no sister. Whatever David had been doing for 8 years, it had nothing to do with family charity. I watched them disappear back inside the house, his arm around her waist in a gesture of casual possession. The door closed behind them, leaving me alone with my shattered assumptions and the terrible knowledge growing in my gut. Part of me wanted to storm up that driveway, pound on that door, demand explanations. But a stronger instinct held me frozen in place. I needed to see more, understand more before I made any moves. I'd read once that the wife is always the last to know. I'd felt smugly certain that would never be me. I'd considered myself observant, attuned to my husband's moods and patterns. Yet here I was, the cliché I'd pitted in other women. About 20 minutes later, the door opened again. This time a little girl came running out. She looked about 7 with dark curly hair and David's exact nose. David's nose. My vision tunneled. The little girl was carrying a baseball mitt and laughing as David chased after her, scooping her up and spinning her around. Her delighted squeals carried across the distance. The young woman stood on the porch, watching them with a smile that spoke of 1,000 similar moments. This wasn't an affair. This was a life. A whole separate life David had built while I'd been home in Philadelphia, believing in family charity and business trips. The girl wrapped her arms around David's neck. He carried her toward the barn, speaking to her with animated gestures. Everything about his body language screamed comfort, belonging, love. I'd been married to this man for 35 years. We'd raised 2 sons together. We'd buried both his parents and mine. I'd held his hand through his father's funeral and celebrated every promotion, every milestone. And apparently for at least 8 years I'd been sharing him with an entire other family. The implications crashed over me in waves. The money obviously was just the start. How many lies had he told? How many late nights at the office had been spent here? How many business conferences had been long weekends with them? My phone buzzed, a text from David, working lunch with clients. Will be home by 6. Love you. The casualness of the lie took my breath away. Love you. As if those words meant anything when they came from a man who was at that very moment playing father to a child I'd never known existed. I sat in that car for 3 hours, watching David live his other life. The little girl whose name I didn't know, the woman who smiled at him with the easy familiarity of years, not months, the way he'd kneel down to tie the child's shoe, patient and attentive in a way I'd forgotten he could be. Our own sons had left home over a decade ago. Michael was in Seattle with his own family. James had moved to London for work. David had seemed content with our empty nest, never expressing any desire for grandchildren beyond polite interest when the boys called. Yet here he was, fully engaged with this child who couldn't be his granddaughter. Not unless the math made sense, and from where I sat, nothing about this situation made any sense at all. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they all went back inside. I waited another agonizing 30 minutes, then made a decision. I couldn't sit in this car forever, and I needed answers more than I needed to protect myself from the truth. The walk to the front door felt like crossing a battlefield. Each step on that gravel driveway crunched too loudly in the afternoon silence. The flower boxes I'd noticed earlier were full of chrysanthemums, the kind David always said were too much work for our own garden. I raised my hand to knock, then paused. Through the window beside the door I could see into the living room. David sat on a comfortable-looking sofa, the little girl curled against his side. He was reading to her from a large picture book, his voice carrying that gentle tone I remembered from when our boys were small. The young woman, his supposed sister Sarah, came in carrying a tray with what looked like hot chocolate and cookies. She set it down, ruffled the child's hair, and kissed the top of David's head before settling in beside them. It was such a domestic scene, so perfectly ordinary that it felt obscene. This was someone's family, someone's normal afternoon. The problem was David already had a family. He had me, though apparently I was the discount version he kept in the closet. I knocked before I could change my mind. The sound seemed to shatter the peaceful tableau. Through the window, I watched David's head snap up, his expression shifting from relaxed contentment to alarm in an instant. The door opened. The young woman stood there, still smiling, clearly expecting a neighbor or delivery person. Her smile faltered when she saw me, an unfamiliar older woman on her porch. "Can I help you?" Her voice was pleasant, genuinely curious. "I'm looking for Sarah," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'm Maggie Sullivan, David's wife." The color drained from her face. Behind her, I heard David's sharp intake of breath, followed by rapid footsteps. He appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of panic that would have been comical if it wasn't destroying my entire world. "Maggie, what are you doing here?" "I found your birthday card," I said simply. "From Sarah and Emma." The young woman, still standing frozen in front of me, made a small sound. "Not Sarah then." Her name was something else, and she just realized that the lie had unraveled. "It's not what you think," David started, which might be the most cliched sentence ever uttered by a caught man. "Really?" I kept my voice pleasant, almost conversational. Years of corporate work had taught me that the quieter you speak, the more people have to lean in to hear you. And I wanted them to hear every word. Because what I think is that for 8 years, you've been sending $500 a month to someone who isn't your sister. What I think is that you've been lying to me every single time you drove out here for your supposed charity visits. What I think is that little girl in there has your nose, your eyes, and probably your DNA. The young woman started crying silently, tears streaming down her face. David looked like he might be sick. "Maggie, please let me explain. Can we go somewhere and talk?" "Oh, I'm not going anywhere," I said. "Not until I understand exactly what I'm looking at. So why don't we start with the truth? What's your real name?" I asked the woman. "Nicole," she whispered. "Nicole Peterson." "And the little girl?" "Emma." Nicole nodded, unable to speak. "Is David her father?" Nicole's yes was barely audible, but it detonated like a bomb in the quiet afternoon. David's face crumbled. All his usual confidence, that take-charge attitude he'd cultivated over decades in corporate law, vanished. He looked old, suddenly older than his 65 years. "How long?" My voice remained eerily calm. Some distant part of my brain noted this with interest. Shouldn't I be screaming, throwing things? Instead, I felt ice cold and crystalline clear. "Maggie, please." David reached for my arm. I stepped back as if he'd tried to strike me. "Don't touch me." Each word came out precisely measured. "How long has this been going on?" Nicole wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. 9 years. We met 9 years ago. 9 years. Emma was 7, which meant Nicole had gotten pregnant about 2 years into whatever this was. 2 years during which David had apparently decided he wanted a do-over at family life. "I'd like to come inside," I said. "Unless you'd prefer the neighbors hear this conversation." Nicole stepped aside wordlessly. David looked like he wanted to protest but thought better of it. I walked into my husband's other home, taking in details with a strange detached fascination. Family photos covered the mantel above the fireplace. David and Nicole on a beach somewhere, both laughing. Emma as a baby, David cradling her with the same tender expression he'd worn with our own sons. The three of them at what looked like a pumpkin patch, all wearing matching plaid shirts. A whole history I knew nothing about, documented in frames that cost more than the $500 monthly dollars I thought was charity. Emma appeared in the doorway connecting to the kitchen, still holding her picture book. She looked between the adults with the worried expression children get when they sense tension but don't understand it. "Mom, who's this lady?" Nicole was mom and David was what? I looked at him, waiting to see how he'd navigate this particular minefield. "Emma, honey, why don't you go play in your room for a bit?" Nicole's voice shook. "Grown-ups need to talk." But Dad was reading me the story. Dad. Of course he was Dad. Why wouldn't he be? He'd been there for birthdays and bedtime stories, for scraped knees and probably first days of school. Just not for our sons' weddings or the birth of our actual grandchildren in Seattle. I'll finish it later, sweetheart, David said quietly. His eyes were red. Good. I hoped it hurt. Emma left reluctantly, casting one more confused glance at me. I waited until I heard a door close somewhere upstairs. So, I said, settling into an armchair that had probably cost 5 monthly payments. Let me see if I understand. 9 years ago you met Nicole. You started an affair. She got pregnant. And instead of, I don't know, divorcing me or being honest, you decided to maintain 2 families. It wasn't like that, David protested weakly. Then please enlighten me. What was it like? I settled back in my chair. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been playing house with a woman young enough to be our daughter while I've been home budgeting our tight finances. But I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation that doesn't make you a lying, cheating fraud. Nicole spoke up, her voice steadier now. I didn't know he was married. Not at first. That surprised me enough to look at her directly. She met my eyes and I saw genuine anguish there. I met David at a farmer's market in town. He said he was recently divorced, working through it. We started seeing each other. By the time I found out the truth, I was already pregnant. And you stayed anyway, I observed. He said he was going to leave you, that he just needed time to figure things out financially to tell you the right way. Nicole's laugh was bitter. I believed him for longer than I should have. But you're still here. He's still here. And I'm still very much married to him. Silence fell heavy in the room. David stood near the window, his back to both of us, shoulders slumped in defeat. The $500 a month, I said. That wasn't the real number, was it? More silence. David, I'm not leaving here without answers. How much? $2,000. His voice was barely audible. Sometimes more, depending on what was needed. $2,000 a month for 8 years. Nearly $200,000 funneled into this second life while I'd been carefully budgeting our retirement accounts. The numbers kept running through my head as I sat in that living room, watching my husband's double life crystallize into cold, hard financial reality. $2,000 monthly payments meant $192,000 over 8 years. But that wouldn't be everything, would it? I want to see the full accounting, I said. Every penny you've spent on this situation, and I want to see it now. David turned from the window, his face a mixture of resignation and something that might have been relief. There's a ledger upstairs in my office. Your office? I almost laughed. Of course you have an office here. Why wouldn't you? It's practically your primary residence. Maggie, please. Show me the ledger, David, unless you'd prefer I start calling lawyers right now. I pulled my phone from my purse, letting it rest pointedly on my knee. He climbed the stairs like a man heading to the gallows. Nicole and I sat in excruciating silence. 2 women whose lives had collided in the worst possible way. She was younger than our son, Michael. That thought made my stomach turn. Did you love him? I asked, surprising myself. Nicole looked up, tears still tracking down her face. I thought I did. Maybe I still do. But I'm tired of being the secret. Emma deserves better than a father who only shows up when his other life permits. How often does he come here? 3, sometimes 4 times a month, weekends mostly. Sometimes he'd take vacation days. Tell you he was at a conference. Every vacation day for the past 8 years suddenly took on new meaning. The legal conference in Pittsburgh that ran long, the training seminar in Harrisburg. All lies, all time spent here building this parallel existence. David returned with a black leather binder. He set it on the coffee table like it might explode. I opened it, forcing myself to read each entry methodically. The monthly payments were there, documented with the kind of precision David brought to all his financial matters. But there was so much more. The down payment on this house, $50,000. Renovations, $32,000. The SUV in the driveway, $40,000 paid in full. Medical bills for Emma's birth, $12,000. Furniture, appliances, Emma's private school tuition, gymnastics lessons, summer camps. By the time I reached the final page, the total made me physically ill. $378,000. You've diverted nearly $400,000 of our money into this. My voice was flat. It was my money too, David said weakly. Money from your salary, your bonuses. I felt a cold realization settling over me. Or is there more you're not telling me? Because these numbers don't add up to just skimming from joint accounts, David. His silence told me everything. We had a joint account for household expenses. A joint retirement fund. You took out a second mortgage on our house last year. Do you remember what you told me that was for? His silence answered for him. You said it was for tax purposes, restructuring for better rates. I laughed, a harsh sound that had no humor in it. I signed those papers trusting you. My name is on that mortgage, David. My credit, my liability. Nicole's face had gone white. You took out a mortgage? The barn. The solar panels. David admitted. Emma's education fund. I wanted to make sure she had everything. With money stolen from your actual wife. Nicole's voice shook with fury. You told me that money came from your bonuses from investments. Jesus, David, you made me complicit in stealing from her. Nobody stole anything, David protested, but even he didn't sound convinced. I closed the ledger with deliberate care. I think we're done here for now. David, you're going to go home, pack a bag, and find somewhere else to stay. Not here, I added, seeing Nicole's alarmed expression. I imagine Nicole has some thinking to do about whether she wants to continue being involved with a man who's lied to everyone in his life. Maggie, we need to talk about this rationally. Rationally? I stood up, gripping my purse. You want rational? Here's rational. I'm 63 years old and I've just discovered my husband has a 7-year-old daughter and a whole second family. You've stolen nearly $400,000. You've put our house at risk. You've lied to me for 9 years. There is nothing rational about any of this, David. I never meant to hurt you. Then you should have divorced me. The words came out harder than I intended. That's what honest people do when they want to be with someone else. They end one relationship before starting another. They don't build elaborate lies and secret lives. I walked toward the door, then paused. Nicole, I'm sorry you were dragged into this. I believe you when you say you didn't know, but you know now. I'd think carefully about what kind of man keeps a woman and child hidden away like a shameful secret for 8 years. I made it approximately 15 miles before I had to pull over. The shaking started in my hands and spread through my entire body until I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. 8 years, no, 9 years. An entire decade of deception. After I could breathe again, I did what any self-respecting, scorned wife would do. I called my attorney's emergency line. Gerald Fisher had handled our estate planning 5 years earlier. He was thorough, discreet, and expensive. Right now I needed all three. Maggie, everything all right? I need to file for divorce immediately, and I need to freeze all joint accounts before my husband cleans them out. The pause on the other end told me Gerald was shifting into crisis mode. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning first thing? I'll be there at 8. And Maggie, don't discuss anything with David. Not finances, not property, nothing. If he calls, tell him your attorney has advised you not to speak with him. I hung up and stared at my phone. One text from David. Please, can we talk about this like adults? Like adults. The man who'd maintained 2 families wanted to discuss adult behavior. I didn't respond. Instead, I called our bank and put a freeze on all withdrawals above $500 from our joint accounts. It would buy me a day, maybe 2, before David realized what I'd done. Then I drove to our house in Philadelphia, the house we'd lived in for 28 years, the house that apparently had a second mortgage I'd unwittingly co-signed. I walked through rooms that suddenly felt like a museum to a life that had never really existed. I called Michael first. It was early morning in Seattle, but this couldn't wait. Mom, everything okay? No, honey, nothing's okay. I need to tell you something about your father. My voice cracked. Can you get James on a 3-way call? You both need to hear this. 10 minutes later, I told them everything. The silence on the line was deafening. I'm flying out tomorrow, Michael said finally, his voice tight with rage. Me too, James added. Mom, are you safe? Do you need us to come tonight? I'm safe. Your father is the one who should be worried. I looked around at the house that no longer felt like home. Come when you can. We'll figure this out together. After we hung up, I started packing David's belongings. Not out of drama or revenge, though there was certainly some satisfaction in it. No, I packed his things because Gerald had said not to discuss anything, and I wanted David's belongings out of my space before I said something I'd regret. By 10 that evening, 12 garbage bags sat in the garage. I'd also found 3 more burner phones hidden in various drawers, each containing texts and photos that confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't just an affair. It was a complete alternate reality. David arrived home at 10:47. I know because I was sitting in the living room with a glass of wine, watching the headlights sweep across the front windows. He came in quietly like a man expecting an ambush. "Your things are in the garage," I said before he could speak. "I've booked you a room at the Marriott on Market Street for the next 2 weeks. After that, you'll need to find more permanent arrangements. Maggie, please. My attorney has advised me not to discuss anything with you. All communication goes through him from this point forward. This is insane. We've been married for 35 years. Apparently not as exclusively as I thought." I took a sip of wine, meeting his eyes over the rim of the glass. "You threw them away," I interrupted. "The moment you decided a secret family was more appealing than being honest with your wife." "I'm just dealing with the aftermath." David slumped into the chair across from me. "What do you want?" "Money. The house. I'll give you whatever you want. What I want is the last 9 years of my life back. Can you give me that?" He had no answer. "I want the trust back, the honesty, the marriage I thought I had. Can you give me any of those things?" More silence. I found the burner phones. All 3 of them, the texts to Nicole, the photos of Emma's birthday parties, her school plays, her first day of 2nd grade. "You were living a completely separate life, David. And the worst part, you were good at it. If I hadn't found that birthday card, how much longer would this have gone on?" "I don't know," he whispered. "Would you have told me when Emma graduated high school, college? Or were you planning to maintain this charade until one of us died?" Something in my voice must have finally broken through his defenses. David buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with sobs that might have moved me once. Before I knew, he'd spent our retirement savings on another woman's child. "Get your things and go," I said quietly. "We'll let the lawyers handle the rest." He left without another word. I heard the garage door open, the sound of bags being loaded into his car, then the engine starting. I sat in that living room until long after his taillights disappeared, finishing my wine and planning exactly how I was going to dismantle the life he'd built on lies. And somewhere in rural Pennsylvania, Nicole was probably having similar thoughts. Gerald Fisher's office smelled like expensive leather and the kind of confidence that comes from winning. I needed both. He sat across from me, reading through the ledger I'd photographed, his expression growing darker with each page. "This is financial fraud," he said finally. "The second mortgage alone. Forged documents showing joint approval when you never actually agreed to the terms he negotiated. That's a felony, Maggie." I signed the papers. My voice was flat. Papers he misrepresented. He thought it was a refinance for better rates. He used it to fund his other family. That's fraud. Gerald set down the documents. "We can destroy him criminally and financially." The words should have felt satisfying. Instead, they just felt heavy. "I want what's mine," I said carefully. "Everything I'm entitled to under Pennsylvania law, but I also want him to face consequences for what he did. He'll lose his law license. The Bar Association doesn't take kindly to attorneys committing fraud, especially against their own spouses." Gerald's smile was sharp. "He'll be unemployable in his field." Good. The vindictive thought surprised me with its intensity. David had built his entire identity around being a successful corporate attorney. Stripping that away felt appropriate somehow. Call it karma with a law degree. "There's more," Gerald said, his tone shifting. "My investigator found another account, one even Nicole didn't know about." He slid a bank statement across the desk. I scanned the numbers, then stopped, read them again, certain I'd misunderstood. "That's $3 million, I said slowly. 3.2 million to be exact, sitting in a Bahamian bank under a corporate shell. Your husband's been siphoning money for at least a decade, Maggie." Gerald pulled out more documents. "Here's the interesting part. He inherited money from his uncle 12 years ago. Remember the one in Connecticut?" I did remember. David had said it was about $50,000, hardly worth mentioning. It was actually $800,000. He told you 50 and pocketed the rest. Then he started using his legal expertise to create offshore entities, moving money through them. A little from his bonuses, a lot from that inheritance, some from careful skimming of joint accounts. Over the years, he's been building this nest egg systematically. I thought about our lives, how David had always insisted we needed to be careful with money, how he'd vetoed my ideas about renovating the kitchen, taking that trip to Italy I dreamed about, helping our sons with down payments on their own homes, all while he was hiding millions in offshore accounts. Turns out we could have afforded Italy after all. We just couldn't afford David's hobby of maintaining secret families. Can we recover it? With the criminal charges and Nicole's cooperation? Yes, most of it. The courts will order repatriation as part of restitution. It'll take time, but you'll get it back. $3 million. Everything I'd sacrificed, no, we can't afford that. David had fed me. It had all been lies. We'd been wealthy. He'd just been hiding it. File the charges, I said. All of them. Today. Gerald made a call. Things moved quickly after that, though not as quickly as I'd hoped. Legal processes never do. By the end of the week, federal marshals arrested David at his office. The Bar Association suspended his license pending investigation. His firm issued a curt statement about alleged improprieties and placed him on administrative leave. The preliminary hearings took 3 weeks. David's lawyer pushed for delays, citing his health. We pushed back. Gerald was relentless. I watched it on the evening news. My husband in handcuffs, doing the perp walk past cameras and reporters. He looked smaller somehow, diminished without his expensive suits and practiced confidence. Michael and James had flown in by then, sitting on either side of me as we watched their father's public humiliation. Nicole called that night. Emma saw it on TV. She's confused, asking why the police took her daddy. What did you tell her? The truth, age-appropriate version, that he made serious mistakes and has to face consequences. She cried for an hour. Guilt twisted in my stomach. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt Emma. I know. And honestly, she needs to learn that actions have consequences, even from people we love. Nicole paused. There's something else. David's lawyer contacted me. He wants to make a deal. What kind of deal? He'll plead guilty to everything, agree to full restitution if we both agree not to testify at trial. He doesn't want Emma watching months of court proceedings. She took a breath. And he's asking for house arrest with hospice care instead of prison. His doctors say he has less than 3 months now. The cancer is spreading fast. The federal prosecutor is willing to agree since he's terminal and a first-time offender, but only if we both consent. What did you say? I said I needed to talk to you first. We're in this together now. I thought about Emma crying over her father's arrest, about David dying alone in a cell versus dying at home, about whether revenge required destroying him completely or if justice could be satisfied another way. Tell his lawyer we'll consider it, I said finally. But I want more than restitution. I want a full accounting of every lie, every dollar, every secret, written and notarized. And I want David to tell our sons the truth himself. Every bit of it. That's fair, Nicole said. I'll let them know. The meeting happened in Gerald's conference room 2 weeks later. David looked terrible, his cancer clearly progressing rapidly despite treatment. He'd lost at least 30 pounds. His skin had a grayish tint and he moved like every step hurt. Part of me felt pity. The larger part remembered $3 million hidden dollars and years of calculated lies. Our sons flanked me on one side of the table. Michael and James had stayed in Philadelphia, taking family leave from their jobs. Both looked shell-shocked, alternating between rage and grief. David sat across from us, his lawyer beside him, Nicole at the far end, a silent witness to this final reckoning. You wanted the truth, David began, his voice raspy. Here it is, all of it. For 2 hours he talked, about meeting Nicole at a farmer's market 9 years ago, about the affair that became a relationship that became a pregnancy, about deciding he wanted to be a father again, to do it better this time, more present and engaged, about the fear of losing everything if he came clean. So he doubled down on the lies instead. I convinced myself I could manage both lives, he said. That I was providing for everyone. I told myself I was being responsible, protective, but really I was being a coward. Michael's jaw was clenched so tight I worried he'd crack a tooth. James had tears streaming silently down his face. The money, I prompted. David pulled out a thick document. Every account, every transfer, every dollar, it's all here. $3.4 million total accumulated over 12 years. I started with Uncle Harold's inheritance, $800,000 that I told you was only 50. I invested it, grew it through careful trading. Then I began moving small amounts from our accounts, from my bonuses. I used my legal knowledge to create offshore structures, hide the movement. He looked at me directly. I told myself it was insurance security. Then it became my escape fund, my freedom money. But really, it was just greed and cowardice. You stole from your family, Michael said, his voice shaking with rage. While James and I struggled with student loans, while Mom worked part-time at the library to help make ends meet, you were hiding millions. Yes. Why? James's question was barely a whisper. Just tell us why. David was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was broken. Because I was selfish. Because I wanted what I wanted without consequences. Because I thought I was smarter than everyone else, that I could manage it all. He looked at me directly. Because I stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you as an obstacle to my happiness. The honesty was brutal, also 35 years too late. I have 6 weeks, David continued. Maybe 8 if the treatment works better than expected. I'm pleading guilty to all charges. The restitution agreement returns everything to your mother. The offshore accounts, the house, all of it. Nicole has agreed to sign over any claim to my estate. Emma shouldn't be punished, I said quietly. Everyone turned to look at me. She's 7 years old. She didn't ask for any of this. I want a trust established for her education. $200,000, separate from David's estate, funded from the recovered money before distribution. Nicole's eyes widened. Maggie, you don't have to. I know, but Emma is innocent in this, and she's going to grow up knowing her father died a criminal. That's punishment enough. She deserves the chance at a good education, a decent start. David was crying silently. Thank you, he managed. I'm not doing it for you, I said coldly. I'm doing it because it's right. Something you never quite figured out. The meeting wrapped up shortly after. Papers were signed, notarized, filed. David would serve house arrest at a facility with hospice care. The money would be returned. Justice of a sort would be served. Michael and James left together, too angry to speak to their father. Nicole gathered her things and gave me one last hug. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. Take care of Emma, I said. And Nicole, find someone who deserves you, someone honest. She nodded and left. David remained, waiting to be transported to the facility. We were alone for the first time since everything had unraveled. I'm sorry, he said. I know it doesn't matter now, but I am truly sorry. You're right, I agreed. It doesn't matter. Sorry doesn't give me back 35 years. Sorry doesn't erase the humiliation or the betrayal. Sorry is just a word, David. And you've proven that words mean nothing. I walked out of that conference room with my head high, $3 million richer and infinitely lighter without the weight of his lies. Gerald had done the math. After legal fees and restitution, I'd net about $2.8 million. Enough to buy a small house somewhere warm, enough to finally take that trip to Italy, enough to help Michael and James buy homes, start the college funds for their kids that David had pretended we couldn't afford. 6 weeks later, I was in Florence when Gerald called to tell me David had died. I was standing in front of Michelangelo's David, the statue, ironically enough. I thanked Gerald for letting me know, ended the call, and went back to admiring the art. I didn't go to the funeral. Neither did Michael or James. Nicole held a small service, she told me later. Just her, Emma, and a few friends. She scattered his ashes in the woods behind the farmhouse. 18 months later, I stood on the balcony of my new apartment in San Diego, watching the sunset paint the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold and crimson. Gerald had called that morning with news that the final offshore account had been recovered. The international legal process had been long, expensive, and frustrating, but persistence paid off. My final total, $2.9 million after all legal fees, taxes, and complications. I'd used some of it to furnish this apartment. More went into trusts for my grandchildren. Michael had used his share to pay off his mortgage. James had invested his. Emma's education fund was safely managed by an independent trustee, ready for her college years. The revenge I'd imagined in those first angry days had morphed into something better. Freedom. Freedom from lies, from a man who'd seen me as an accessory rather than a partner. Freedom to finally live on my own terms. My phone buzzed. A text from Nicole, who'd become an unlikely friend. Emma started 3rd grade today. Sent you a photo. The photo showed a smiling little girl with a backpack almost as big as she was. She had David's nose and Nicole's eyes and absolutely none of the blame for the chaos her existence had caused. I texted back a heart emoji and a message of congratulations. Then I poured myself a glass of wine, turned on some jazz, and watched the sun sink into the Pacific. Somewhere David was gone. His lies were exposed. His carefully constructed dual life had collapsed into truth. And me, I was finally, completely, gloriously free. The sunset was beautiful. The wine was excellent. And for the first time in 35 years, my life was entirely, wonderfully my own. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.